Do you want to learn more on how to put money to work in regenerative food and agriculture? Follow our video course via investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course or in the links below. Now, on to the podcast. This interview is about quality, nutrient density and flavor of food and their connection with soil health and human health. I think it's safe to say that if Dan and the team at the Bionutrient Food Association get it right, they will change the entire food and agriculture sector for the better. Welcome to another episode of Investing in Regenerative Agriculture, Investing as if the planet mattered, a podcast show where I talk to the pioneers in the regenerative food and agriculture space to learn more on how to put our money to work to regenerate soil, people, local communities and ecosystems while making an appropriate and fair return. Why my focus on soil and regeneration? Because so many of the pressing issues we face today have their roots in how we treat our land, grow our food and what we eat. And it's time that we as investors, big and small, and consumers start paying much more attention to the dirt/soil underneath our feet. In March last year, we launched our Patreon community to make it easy for fans to support our work. And so many of you have joined as a member. We've launched different types of benefits, exclusive content, Q&A webinars with former guests, Ask Me Anything sessions, plus so much more to come in the future. For more information on the different tiers, benefits and how to become a member, check patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or find the link below. Thank you. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm Koen van Seijen, your host, and today I interview Dan Kittredge, organic farmer, founder of the Bionutrient Food Association, working hard to demonstrate the connections between plant health, soil health, carbon sequestration, crop nutritional value, flavor, and human health. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you for having me.
And to start with a personal question, why soil? Why the Real Food campaign, which we'll dive deeper into? What brought you to the place where you are now as a founder of the Bionutrient Food Association? Very long question and long answer, obviously, but let's try to keep it short.
Potentially, that's a long answer. In short, my background as an organic farmer, growing up on an organic farm and also having my parents run an organic farming organization, gave me perspective when I tried to set off and have my own farm about how much I knew and didn't know about how to make a living farming. A lot of this work started from a very practical standpoint, which was the techniques and principles that I had been trained in were not sufficient to produce healthy plants. And if your plants are sick, your cost of production is high and you have a hard time making a living. So I started just very pragmatically on how to produce plants that are more healthy by attending conferences and seminars, reading books, and in short order found that I was able to, without much changing of what I was doing, deeper understanding, really profoundly affect the health of my plants, which correlated with better yields, better pest and disease resistance, and better economic viability. And as I got into it further, the connections between soil building, carbon sequestration, flavor, aroma, shelf life, human health, all seem to be tied intimately into this same deeper understanding. And so I started to give workshops at conferences and then courses, and then that's functionally evolved into this Bionutrient Food Association, the organization which I'm executive director of. And so over the past 10 years, we have built an organization that's primarily based in North America, although we have plenty of allies globally. We've got local chapters in about 15 different states and a couple provinces in Canada. We do an annual conference. We do 2-day intensive seminars. And we've been working for quite some time now in helping farmers understand better how to work with nature. Our basic idea is that plants have evolved to grow, and the more we can manage our soils in a fashion so that the plants are able to do what they've evolved to do, the better it is for everybody involved. So a short introduction, perhaps.
Yeah, but a lot to unpack there, actually. So your starting point was really organic, or growing up on an organic farm and being an organic farmer, but you took it and are still taking it to a whole new level. Does that simply mean that organic isn't good enough, or what was the main was it the missing focus on plant health, for instance, or what was the main starting point of that journey that you found like it's not economically viable, there has to be more? Because many see organic as already quite radical, and you're actually going quite some steps beyond that.
Well, yeah, like all of these terms, Christian or Democrat or Republican, depending on your framework, it's a very broad community. There's a bunch of different kinds of organic farmers, et cetera, and different understandings. But I think a deeper understanding of how life works has not been part of the organic understanding. We have, through our organization, tried to really tease out the wisdom from the organic community, as well as from the permaculture community and the agroecology, from biodynamics, from conventional agriculture. Our thought is that life is actually what's going on here, and we have these different modes of understanding and working with it, but let's be more integrated in our understanding, and let's have there be some practical modes of assessment of success. For one, I think if a crop is being attacked by a flesh-eating fungus, that's usually a sign of poor health. Let's acknowledge that and say we may have organically approved fungicides, but that does not mean that we're producing high-quality food. It just means we're not using certain synthetic chemicals. So the conclusion we've come to after a number of years is that really the nutritional value of the food is what matters. The flavor, the aroma, the nutritive value correlates with the health of the person that eats it, the health of the plant, the health of the soil and the ecosystem. And so that would be a point around which we could potentially come together. Just to sort of jump ahead a little bit, we've done some research now and sampled crops from around the U.S. and looked at some of these nutritional compounds. One of them, polyphenols, it's a family of compounds that correlate with sort of cancer, healing and things like that. In our research last year, we sampled 600 carrots from around the country, different, stores, farmers markets, farms, organic, conventional. And the nutritional variation in polyphenols was 20,000%. This is not a small number. There is a massive nutritional variation in food, which correlates to the health of the plant, correlates to the health of the human that eats it. And so we're not saying organic is bad or conventional is bad or biodynamics is bad. We're saying let's integrate the wisdom from these different communities and let us be assessed by the actual health of the food we produce. And let that be the real marker, not the label or the marketing scheme.
Which is, it makes obviously a ton of sense. Let's focus on the quality of the food. What does it need to do? It needs to nourish you. So we need to look at nutrients. But it's also a very, I wouldn't say new thought, but contradictory, because you don't have certifications for that. We finally have organic and everybody starts to know it and starts to double-digit growth in the supermarkets, etc. When with the Real Food campaign and the Bionutrient Food Association on the issues of quality, was there or is there a standard of quality, or that had to be completely developed of what we actually mean by good food?
Well, the Real Food campaign is this collaborative project that we are helping to establish, which is working with different universities, organizations, companies, etc., to do three basic things. One is to build a tool that a consumer can use to test quality in real time, as in flash a light like a smartphone camera flash at a carrot, and then get a reading out which says relatively how good this is. So build a tool that can do that is one thing that no one's done yet, which we've got the first generation of it out already. The second step is to identify the variation in quality. And to your question, there does not seem to be any database anywhere globally that I've been able to find, at least in 10, 12 years of looking and asking people who would know. There's no database which identifies the variation in nutrient levels within a crop. So this carrot relative to that carrot, et cetera. And so that's what we're, to your question, we're working on, is populating that database so that we can begin to say something intelligent about relatively how good this carrot is versus that carrot. There's a third step to the campaign, a third leg of the stool, as it were, which is what are the environmental conditions, which management practices, which soil types, fertility programs, varieties of crops, microbiome, dynamics? What are the environmental conditions which cause which quality results? And so our long-term hope is to be able to give growers the ability to shift their management practices during the growing season based on this information so that we can functionally increase the nutritive value of food across the board, whether it's organic or local or biodynamic or whatever. Is that we want to support growers globally of all scales in producing food that's more nutritious because of the profound impacts it can have on human health and environmental health. We can sequester all the carbon we need to bring CO2 levels back to where they were 250 years ago. If we did agriculture well, we can do that in 10 years. If globally farmers started to manage their soils in such a manner as to be producing crops that were really quite nutritious, a side benefit of that is massive drawdown of carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. So, yeah, the campaign is focused on the logistics of supporting consumers in purchasing food that's more nutritious, and we think that economic driver of consumers choosing the food that's most nutritious for them will inspire farmers to do a better job producing crops that are more nutritious. I may have jumped ahead.
No, absolutely a key point, because you're saying that connection has already been shown between nutrient-dense food or food that's more nutritious and soil health and thus soil carbon. There's no way to cheat that or to set up a very fancy greenhouse or vertical farm. Is that a rock solid connection? Like, we know if this is a very nutritious carrot, that it had to be grown in a very healthy soil?
I'm sure there are ways with hydroponic systems to produce carrots that are much more nutritious than what's on the shelf right now. But if money is a factor, if cost of production is a piece of the puzzle, we'll never be able to do it as economically as with collaboration with microbes in the soil. That is the most efficient way to produce crops that are highly nutritious.
If it would be an honest market system, the consumer, and then there's obviously the consumer that wants certain things, but the consumer pooling and asking and demanding nutrient-dense carrot or nutrient-dense food in general would be a very, very strong trigger for growers and farmers that I think already in many cases, I mean, the ones that attend your conferences and your sessions and your courses want to grow more nutrition-dense food, but at the moment they have no way of distinguishing themselves from the next guy or girl on the farmer's market with carrots that look exactly the same, but are maybe completely different. That's what you're saying.
Yes. And foundationally, there's this, it seems to be an assumption, an unquestioned assumption in the general public, which is that all food is basically the same, that all carrots have the same thing in them, that all milk has the same thing in it, etc. It's basically uniform, like plastic or steel.
It's one thing.
It's a uniform material, and that is just absolutely not true. And so that, there's a major hurdle there in telling the story, explaining the fact that this variation exists. But then if that story is told, the corollary of it is that there's a direct connection between the nutritional value of the food that you eat and your parents ate and your grandparents ate and the diseases that you're suffering or your children perhaps are suffering. We have epidemic levels of chronic illness anywhere where the food supply chain has gone towards a quote-unquote Western diet. And it has a massive amount to do with the fact that we're able to mass produce food, but it is nutritionally quite devoid. And so that's what most of us have been eating now for a couple of generations, maybe not in more rural areas, but at least here in North America, for a couple of generations, we've been eating food that is devoid of nutrition, and we are physiologically falling apart. And so while I think that the climate angle is important, I think the visceral self-interest of your child is sick, and a really good way to help your child not be sick anymore is to feed your child food that is most nutritious. If the cost of production is lower because you're working with nature, then it doesn't have to be more expensive for the consumer. So, yeah, we think that there's a really significant opportunity here if we can engage some transparency and some, deeper understanding to rapidly shift a lot of these issues, which seem to be quite serious globally.
Yeah, if you think about it, it's is ridiculous. We're pushing for clean labels, etc., but it still says tomatoes. And maybe if you're lucky, I mean, I live in a country or spend a lot of time in a country where at least the type of tomatoes is mentioned, but that still doesn't say anything about the nutritional value. And even if it would be slightly more expensive, but the nutritional value would be double, you could argue that it's a much cheaper product. And probably, I think you're right in terms of the pull factor of healthcare versus carbon sequestration, etc. It's just much, much stronger, the healthcare part. And carbon will ever be, unless you live on an island that's about to disappear under the sea.
There is a lot of consternation in people's minds right now, a lot of concern about the climate, which is good. It's about time. But I don't think people are really going to stop driving cars and flying airplanes. And as far as I'm concerned, we don't have to. All you have to do is choose the food off the shelf that is more nutritious than the one next to it. Do you have 2 choices of carrots to purchase, 2 choices of oranges, 2 choices of beef or milk or rice, or 3 or 4? Well, all we're saying is if you choose the one that's more nutritious, you can functionally help reverse climate change. Yes, that's a nice corollary, but what you're really doing is healing yourself.
And
we think it's a good story.
I think it's an absolutely brilliant story, very strong. I think the whole regeneration piece of yourself plus the land that you're supporting by eating it is probably going to be one of the main stories of this century. But I have a but. Do you see, like, in a supermarket in, let's say, the United States, if you choose one orange over another one, is there already enough supply of nutrient-dense ones, or are most of them relatively the same? What have you seen so far, or is it too early to answer that question? Is there enough choice for me if I walk into a random place where I normally buy my food?
There is significant variation. I gave you the number 20,000%. That's the full variation that we found. But within any grocery store, there's easily 100% or 200% variation within the crops that are available. They may all still be relatively poor. They likely are still relatively poor. But our thought is, if you think of a carrot, the most nutritious carrot is 100, and something that's basically empty is 1. Most carrots are between 15 and 35. That's where they're at. Or maybe it's, 8 and 15. They're relatively low, but there is still a significant variation. And so our thought is that this is going to be an evolutionary process whereby people start buying the 30s and start leaving the 15s on the shelf. And then the people that are growing 15s realize they have to up their game. So they start to produce 35s and 40s, and then their crops start to move off the shelf. And then the people who are doing 30 start to, up their game and get up to 50. Our thought is this is a competition to the top. If we can establish a visceral economic incentive to inspire people to compete to do better, then we have succeeded. So it will be an evolutionary, evolving, iterative process. But that's our understanding of how it could work.
And where are you now? We're in April 2019. You described the campaign, and we shortly touched upon the Bionutrient Food Association. What does your week look like, or your month? What's the main thing at the moment in this huge evolution? Because this is a long-term process, and it's been a long time in the making. What's keeping you busy? What are you working on at the moment?
What I'm working on at the moment actually is a pre-order campaign for the first generation of really consumer-built, mass-produced, calibrated spectrometers. We expect to be, putting that out. We have tools right now which are quite functional.
Yeah, I actually ordered one. It should come in the next few weeks. Maybe when this is out, it already came in, and I started playing with it and sharing data. But I would definitely annoy anybody with that thing when it gets in.
Some people like things like that and will play around and do experiments and stuff. But our thought is for the consumer, it should be as simple and easy as possible. And so the version we have right now is not that. The version we have now is for tinkerers and researchers and sort of activists. So we're hoping we will be launching next month this, campaign for pre-order of this consumer calibrated tool. We're aiming for 10,000 units as our first serious batch. We're going to be promising that it'll be available in 2 years, although I think likely it'll be less time than that, but we would rather be conservative than overpromise. Just an anecdote, we have a a large supermarket chain in the US called Whole Foods, which is associated with being a little bit more upscale, organic, etc. And a number of years ago, when I was talking to one of the regional buyers for Whole Foods for the northeast corner of the US about this project and this opportunity, I said, wouldn't you like to be part of this project? Because then you could show that your stuff is better than your competition. And they said, no, really, we don't want to have any empirical assessment of what's going on. However, when you are 2 years from the consumers being able to tell how good our stuff is, please come tell us, because then we'll give our growers 2 years to meet standard. So it's an interesting dynamic.
That's about now, right? Let's give them a fair warning. Yeah.
That's what we're going to do next month, is launch this and say, okay, heads up, supply chain, here we are. This is what we're doing. At this trajectory, in 2 years, consumers will be able to test the variation of quality at the grocery store, in the farmer's market, in real time.
And just to give an idea, that's a little like pocket size spectrometer that you can point at a carrot and tells you that what you were saying before, between 1 and 100 or whatever the spectrum will be, tells you the nutrient density.
It'll probably be the size of a deck of playing cards, and will probably connect to your phone with a tether, a little cord, like a earbuds cord. And so, yeah, it'll be, I don't know what that size is in centimeters. It's probably 3 inches by, 2 inches by 1 inch or something.
It will be small. Yeah. That's
small.
Yeah,
exactly. And like any app, you press the button on your phone to take the picture, and the answer pops up on your phone right there. So it's quite exciting. And our hope is that we've already gotten interest from various industries like blueberries and coffee and milk and things like that, companies that are involved in producing those crops. Our thought is that we want to work with the farmers and the supply chain companies to help them improve the quality of the crops they're producing, so that when the consumers can have this tool, that their stuff looks better.
And just for my idea, in terms of milk and coffee, would I be pointing it at the bottle of milk? Would I be pointing it at the cup of coffee, or would I be pointing it at the beans? How would it work?
Well, with the coffee people, we were talking about all the way up to the farmers in the mountains and whatever it is, Peru or India, that are growing it.
Really, at the farmers level? Wow.
So they could flash a leaf while the coffee bush is growing and understand how to support the plant in being healthier. And then the buyers would flash the light at the raw bean and choose which beans to purchase at what price all the way through. So yeah, there's all kinds of opportunities here. There is naturally going to be a consumer tool, which will give you relatively how good this is. And then there's going to be a business grade tool, which will be more expensive, which would give specific levels of specific compounds and elements.
Extremely, extremely interesting. Let's shift gears a bit to the finance side, or the investor or the impact investor side of things, as this podcast is listened by them as well. What would be, you've mostly been working on the business side and on the growing side. What does all this real food campaign and the focus on the quality of the food, what does it mean for investors that are maybe already invested actually in agriculture and food, or are looking at that and want to basically unlock the potential impact? What does this movement mean for them?
Well, I guess it depends on where they're invested. We expect that this will be fairly disruptive to the food supply chain.
I can imagine. Yeah.
And we're doing this based on the data. We're not, trying to be evangelical about saying we have the answer. We're saying this is what the data tells us. So our thought is that farmers are going to be able to understand how to grow crops more well, which is not which means they're not going to be using synthetic fertilizers and toxic chemicals. You cannot produce high quality food while you're killing life. It just doesn't work well that way. So we expect a profound shift in the production of food, and which genetics, which of the varieties of crops have a better inherent potential to produce nutritive food. A lot of the seed that's been hybridized and genetically modified is not been bred for nutritive value. In fact, many of the old open pollinated heirloom varieties of crops are the ones that have a better inherent potential there. So from fertility to seed to genetics, we're working with a company called General Mills here in the US, which makes Cheerios, and they've been doing market research, and the fathers who buy the Cheerios for the children would like to know that their Cheerios are nutritious. So General Mills wants to know what are the practices by which oats are grown more well, so that they can put on the label that their Cheerios are more nutritious than the competition. So if you think about that whole supply chain and market dynamic, we expect significant shifts. When you pick tomatoes unripe, like they do in this country, and then ship them and then, gas them with ethylene, and then they turn a reddish color. When you pick a crop unripe, it doesn't have in it the full suite of nutrients that it could have. And so our thought is that the mass production of agriculture is going to be more difficult, that farmers who are picking things, more locally growing in a more of a polyculture dynamic, are going to be out competing the ones that are growing in the monocultures and picking raw and things like that.
It's an absolute massive ripple effect, obviously, if we start selecting for qualities and we start selecting for flavor, which sounds ridiculous that we didn't, but we did not, because we had to produce as many calories as possible, at least. And in Europe, the thought after the Second World War, just never hunger again. And we managed to do that, but it came at an enormous cost to everything else, basically. But I don't think we can underestimate how big of a shift this potentially could be. I don't think you are underestimating it, but it's good to remind the listeners to that.
There's other corollaries, ecosystem services, the carbon markets. There's, with the data we're collecting and the hardware we're building, we'll have the ability to actually monetize that carbon sequestration. We were talking to Danone, which I think is a European company. After the Paris Climate Accords, they made a commitment to be carbon neutral. And so they were looking at all of the aspects of their supply chain and understanding that when cows are eating grass, they're actually carbon neutral or carbon negative. They're functionally sequestering carbon, but when cows are eating grain, they're not. They're causing increased carbon in the atmosphere. So there's that whole vector. As far as I'm concerned, the revolution in healthcare is going to be profound. We know from our indigenous, traditional wisdom, the role of medicinal plants or herbs and things like that. I think it was Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, who said, "Let food be thy medicine." We have correlated, the data exists to show these mineral deficiencies, these nutrient deficiencies correlate with these chronic illnesses, cancer, heart disease, etc. So we're going to be able to prescribe food to people to help systemically heal these ailments, which are now just managed by the major healthcare system. So yeah, I would expect a dramatic decrease in the need for pharmaceuticals, in medical devices, etc. The implications are quite exciting, actually.
Extremely exciting. And again, I'm going to repeat myself. I'm very excited for this device. The first version, I know it's the developer kit, which means it's going to have some tinkering needed, etc. But I'm very excited what it means for me personally, but also in work, etc. What kind of pushback do you get? Because you're disrupting, or in the process of disrupting, some very powerful industries that have been built over the last years to basically go against completely what we're talking about here. If you want to share, if you can share, have you had a lot of pushback? Have you had a strong, I remember interviewing Satya Tripathi from India, disrupting on the zero budget natural farming in one of the regions there and getting a lot of pushback from the fertilizer industry and the subsidized fertilizer industry, obviously. But he was standing up to that. What have you been getting through over the last 12 years? And now that you're actually getting up to steam and not even getting support from Whole Foods, how has been that journey?
Well, I would say that we have not experienced much resistance. There have been people such as yourself who've said, boy, you should be worried about your safety. But our strategy is to work with anybody who wants to work with us. We're not opposed to Monsanto. They've got an amazing global supply chain. And if they want to understand the data that we're collecting and support farmers in producing better crops, so be it. Let them. We need to transition agriculture globally in short order. So we're not against anybody. We're for life and for vitality, and we're happy to work with anybody who wants to engage. I think to a large degree, we're pretty small. We haven't made a lot of noise in social media, et cetera.
You're right, because everybody I talk to is like, does it exist? I said, no, it's coming. But a lot of people haven't seen or followed your work, I think. Until the last 6 months or so, I haven't seen it popping up in many, many places, which maybe has been good in this case.
I think, speak softly and carry a large stick was, I think Teddy Roosevelt, one of our presidents, was one of his mottos. Let's not talk a lot about what we're doing. Let's do it. And it is a bit of a paradigm shift. It is a bit of a entirely different way of looking at things. And when you've got the current model that's invested in a certain perspective, and we're coming at things from a really different perspective, they can't even see us, I don't think. They can't even see what we're up to because we just don't register in their field.
You're not even on their competitor list, or threat list. You're off the radar. It's
a concept that I haven't even identified as a potential issue. And so, and I tell people publicly, like, I'm happy to work with anybody who wants to work with us in understanding what causes better quality. And there's going to be a need for all number of businesses to support this process. There's going to be a bunch of people getting quite rich that are, especially the early adopters in it. So, I think our strategy of A, being willing to collaborate with anyone, and B, just coming from such a different perspective has successfully, at least thus far, prevented any serious resistance.
That's very good to hear. And I want to be conscious of your time and end with a final question, which usually gets into 2 or 3 final questions. If you could give advice to, and imagine there's a room full, let's say a theater full of smart impact investors, at least we all consider ourselves smart, listening to this podcast, and they have read about soil, the potential of carbon, they read Drawdown, they've followed some of the innovative farmers on the Regen Ag side, and they would like to put some of their money or maybe all of their money to work. And without giving them investment advice, what would be your first step for them if they want to get started in really understanding the agriculture space and being part of this, I wouldn't say a small transition, but a gigantic transition that you're basically pushing?
I'm biased.
Everybody is.
And I'm very, so with that caveat, I think that what we're doing is quite revolutionary, and engaging with our organization, with our data collection, with our process is going to empower people, regardless of where they're at in the supply chain, in being leaders in the near future. So we're doing the data collection necessary to really identify what the causal dynamics are that correlate with better quality. So anybody who's working with us to engage in data collection is going to know more than their competitors. They'll be more well established in success. If you're in the supply chain and you're purchasing crops and you're processing them, et cetera, working with us to help understand the variation so that you can choose which crops are better means that you're going to be well positioned when this whole thing hits. So I don't know. I mean, I don't travel in those investor funder worlds very much. I don't know where the plays are, as it were, in purchasing land and revitalizing already existing plantations, et cetera. I would welcome conversation with anybody who's interested. I'd be happy to come and speak to a group of people in Milan or wherever who are interested. I think that there's we are an NGO, a nonprofit educational organization. Everything we're doing is in the commons, which means it can't be controlled or owned. So the engineering for the tool, the algorithm for the definition of quality, the app, the data set, all that stuff is in the commons. And until it's properly built and fleshed out, what I'm talking about can't occur. So we need actually those social impact investors. They're a small amount of money from them could profoundly move this process forward.
Yeah, I would even imagine it would just speed it up. I mean,
Right.
it's happening anyway. The train has left the station and is moving, but
and
speed is important here.
at some point, it's going to start happening quite rapidly, and
Yeah.
the people who engage at the ground level are going to be positioned ahead of the competition. So, yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure that's a good enough answer. But
Absolutely. No, definitely. I think the data collection, the engaging an organization, depending on where you are and what you can and want to do. And I think that the push and the asking questions around quality and around management and those correlations is something that we don't do often enough anyway. And we often think tomatoes are tomatoes or carrots are carrots. And to ask the final question, if you could change one thing in the agriculture and food industry, if you could wave your magic wand and tomorrow morning we all wake up and that thing has changed, what would it be?
I think it's what I'm working on. If I could ask for anything to change tomorrow, I wave my magic wand, it would be that there's an understanding of variation in food quality, that food is not uniform. If we understood the variation and the implications of it, all the rest of these shifts would flow very naturally.
I want to thank you so much, Dan. I'm looking forward to follow you. I'm looking forward to use the tool and looking very much forward to checking in with you as part of this transition. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Wonderful talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed this interview about food quality, nutrient density, and how the focus on that could change the whole food and agriculture sector. Let's see in the next years if Dan is right. If you found the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food podcast valuable, there are a few simple ways you can use to support it. Number 1, rate and review the podcast on your podcast app. That's the best way for other listeners to find the podcast, and it only takes a few seconds. Number 2, share this podcast on social media or email it to your friends and colleagues. Number 3, if this podcast has been of value to you and if you have the means, please join my Patreon community to help grow this platform and allow me to take it further. You can find all the details on patreon.com/regenerative agriculture or in the description below. Thank you so much and see you at the next podcast. Dear friends of the podcast, I'm super excited to share with you the online video course Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. How to put money to work in regenerating soils at scale and growing a lot of tasty food while doing it. Why are we doing this course? After 100 interviews and more than 100 hours of audio asking the question how to put money to work in regenerating soils, and have been following the space since 2011 and recording these podcasts since 2016, we thought it was time to share our lessons learned. What have we seen in the space over the last years? How have we built our decision-making framework? What to focus on with the podcast? How have we picked interviewees? And what questions should you ask? What is happening in the space? What should you read? What should you listen? What should you watch? How to approach this space? For whom is this course? You, the soil builders and investors in this space. The soil builders, people working in this space, entrepreneurial farmers, fund managers, vehicle builders, crowd investing, platform builders, agtech companies, farm-to-gut food companies, permaculture, keyline designers, holistic management consultants, etc., etc. People that are building soil at scale. And the investors who are putting their own money to work through their family office or as private individuals, or people who are putting other people's money to work through foundations, institutional capital, banks, insurance companies, etc. Is this course free? No. This is pay what you think it's worth. Meaning, I have no way of knowing what this course will be worth to you. And I'm very aware that among the listeners of this podcast, we have people with very different means. So I'm inviting you, if this course is creating value to you, and if you have the means, to consider paying what you think it's worth. Thank you. So what is this course? It's currently a series of 17 videos, mostly ranging from 10 to 15 minutes, plus PDF slides, so you don't have to ride along. We're gonna look into why invest in regenerative agriculture and why extractive agriculture is so risky, how to invest, what kind of frameworks you could and I think should build, what to invest in, what kind of co-investors you could find, or what kind of investors you could find if you're a soil builder. Every lesson will have a digging deeper part where I will share what kind of reports, what kind of interviews, what kind of videos you can look into if you want to dig deeper. We're going to look at nutrient density, landscape design, and a lot more. So what is it not? It's not a list of investable deals. Unfortunately, That doesn't exist in this world. We're really at the beginning of the regenerative agriculture and food revolution. It's also not investment advice. Before making any investment, please find professional investment advice. So get ready, get a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, or whatever you're drinking. Click on the link below, sign up, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback.